You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. Welcome to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, come on over, watch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the live chat room going on right now with the other Intrepids. Have a good time this evening. It's Friday. It's the end of the week. You got the weekend ahead of you. What are your plans? You got anything cool going on? I know my wife has been gone with my 11-year-old son, almost 11-year-old son, for the last 3 days. Now they've got one more day up at Boy Scout camp. And she is a leader in the Cub Scouts, and so she took him up this year. And it'll be his introduction from transition from Cub Scouts to Boy Scouts. It's an exciting time. And now, I never went all the way up through into the Boy Scouts and all of that. I was a Cub Scout when I was a kid, like a lot of other guys. But we're also talking the 60s. It was a very different feel back then than it is now. And so different things going on. I sometimes am concerned that my own son looks at Cub Scouts and the ideals that they're teaching there, and it doesn't really sink in. There have been times I've had to use that when parenting to say, hey, you're a Cub Scout, but you don't do the things that Cub Scouts do, that Boy Scouts do. You're not sticking to the principles you're being taught. Is that something that you notice? And he doesn't really notice it. So you got to point it out. You got to say, hey, if you're going to do this and learn things, why not live it? So hopefully some of these things start to really stick for him and they sink in. I know a lot of good men who were in Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts to Boy Scouts, and they came out of that. They made it all the way to Eagle Scout, and they've got that in their heritage, and they're passing that on to their kids. And so it's a good thing. But my whole point was that my wife has been gone for a few days with my oldest son. I've been home alone with my 8-year-old daughter and my 5-year-old daughter. And it's challenging sometimes, but they're usually pretty quiet. They do their own thing. We go out, we go to the store, we go play, we do stuff. And they pretty much like to watch their shows and color their pictures, go play with their friends in the neighborhood. So it's given, it's a little break from, half of the hubbub is gone. So that's where I'm at, and that's where I'm at mentally. I'm in a pretty good place. So today, I want to pick up our series where we left off. None of that, by the way, was relevant to anything that we're doing here, other than my state of mind, and which seems to be pretty good this morning. And so let's go into talking about some of the things that we left off on last night. We ended talking about the Apache and Cochise. We ended with the death of Cochise. And we're getting into now something we haven't touched on. That's the California Indians. Now remember, we in the United States at the time, we're talking right around the early 1870s. 1873, thereabouts. And the United States has started expanding west. We kind of hop-skipped over the central part of America, crossed the Rockies and went over into California and the West Coast, and we started making settlements there in big cities over there. So we're kind of putting this squeeze play on the Plains Indians and the Indians in the middle, in Arizona and New Mexico and up into Nebraska and Wyoming and places like that, the Dakotas. And so the Indians out on the West Coast seem to be not having as much problem at the beginning. And if you look at it, we're talking, by the way, we're going to start talking about the ordeal of Captain Jack. This is the original Captain Jack, not Jack Sparrow, mind you. But we're talking about the original Captain Jack. Of the Modoc Indians, and Kinpuash was his name. And California Indians were gentle. They were as gentle as the climate in which they lived. And at night, it might be different today. You go to L.A. and some of the big cities in California, it's like, I don't want to go there again. It's not a gentle place to live, but they were pretty gentle people. The Spaniards gave them names, established missions for them, converted and debauched them. That's an interesting grab bag, isn't it? We're going to convert you to Christianity, then debauch you. And tribal organizations were undeveloped among the California Indians, and each village had its own leader. But there were no great war chiefs among these very unwarlike people. And after the discovery of gold in 1848, however, white men from all over the world poured into California by the thousands, taking what they wanted from the submissive Indians, debasing those whom the Spaniards had not already debased, and then systematically exterminating whole populations that are now long forgotten. Name for me off the top of your head, without looking it up, any California Indian tribes. And so, no one remembers the Cholulas. How about the Chimarcos? The Uribores? How about the Nipawai? The Alonas? Or 100 other bands whose bones have been sealed under millions of miles of freeways, parking lots, and slab track housing. Do you remember any of those tribes? Do you ever remember hearing of those tribes? One exception to the non-resistant Indians of the California were the Modocs. They lived in the harsher climate of Tule Lake, Tule, T-U-L-E, Tule Lake, along the border of Oregon. And until the 1850s, white men were almost unknown to the Modocs. Then settlers began coming in droves. They seized the best lands, and they expecting the Modocs to just submit weekly. Hey, we're taking your land, okay? See you Friday. When the Modocs showed fight at all, white invaders attempted to exterminate them all. The Modocs retaliated with ambushes. Now, stop for a second and think of the moral implications of this. You found that there's gold in them hills, but the land is owned, or the people on the land are people that are kind of in the way of your getting at the gold. So you find ways to move them off and exterminate them, kill them off. All for what? For gold. So during this time, there was a young Modoc named Kinpuash. He was coming to manhood, and he couldn't understand why Modocs and white people just couldn't live together without trying to kill each other. He's like, what's going on here? And the Tule Lake country was as limitless as the sky, with enough deer, antelope, ducks, geese, fish, and camas roots for everybody. Kinpuash scolded his father for not making peace with the white men. His father, who was chief, told Kinpuash that the white men were treacherous and would not be driven out before there could be peace. And not long afterward, the chief was killed in a fight with white settlers, and Kinpuash became chief of the Modoc. Kinpuash went into the settlements to find white men he could trust so that he could make peace with them. He went out, he said, let's find the guys that think the way I think. Let's look for peace. This is kind of current day when you see things. Take this into a different global economic political scenario. Look at the way we are with the Middle East, with Iran. You look at the leadership of Iran. You look at the leadership of the United States, constantly fighting, constantly at war. When the people, for the most part, are kind of like, why are we fighting all the time? We want open borders. We want people to enjoy each other, enjoy our nation. We want to enjoy your nation. But what keeps us from having that peace? The people who are in charge, who want to keep killing each other. So, I'm not talking kumbaya peaceism here, folks. I'm talking the reality of life on Earth, life amongst humans. We know that, how do you say this without getting too overly philosophical? We know that you get a bunch of people together, there's going to be fighting. Any tribe, any household, there's always going to be something. You got to work for ways to find peace. This is all Kinpuash wanted. And he went into the settlement, so he went out there. He went looking for white guys who thought the way he thought. At Eureka, he met some good men, and soon all the Modocs were coming there to trade. I have always told white men when they come to my country, Kinpuash said, that if they wanted a home to live there, they could have it. Come on in. And I never asked them for any pay for living there, as my people lived. I like to have them come there and live. I like to be with white people. It was just fine. He had no problem. Come on in. There's room for everybody. The young chief also liked the clothes that they wore, their houses, their wagons, their fine livestock. The white men around Eureka gave these visiting Indians new names, which the Modocs found kind of amusing. And they often used these names amongst themselves. Kinpuash was Captain Jack. Some of the others were Hooker Jim, Steamboat Frank, Scar-Faced Charlie, Boston Charlie, Curly-Headed Doctor, Shack Nasty Jim. I need that on a shirt. I want to be Shack Nasty Scotty. Shanchin John. And Ellen's Man. These are the names the whites were giving them. And they were kind of amused by it. And they said, cool, we'll take it. And so during the time of the white man's Civil War, troubles arose between the Modocs and the settlers. A Modoc couldn't find a deer to kill for his family. He would sometimes kill a rancher's cow. Look at the different system of the way things were done back then. Or if he needed a horse, he would borrow one out of a settler's pasture. The Modocs' white friends excused this as a tax that the Indians were levying on the settlers for the use of their lands. But most settlers didn't like this at all, and through their politicians arranged for a treaty to remove the Modocs from the Tule Lake country. So they've moved in there on Modoc land, and now eventually they don't like the way the Modocs act, so they want the Modocs moved off their land. And so the treaty commissioners promised Captain Jack and the other head men that if they would move north to a reservation in Oregon, every family would have its own land, its own teams of horses, wagons, farming implements, tools, clothing, and food. You see this repeating? Here's our treaty. Here's what we will promise you if you let us have your land. And you move off of it, so there's no conflicts. And this was all going to be provided by the government. Captain Jack wanted to have his land near Tule Lake, but the commissioners would not agree to this. Somewhat reluctantly, Jack signed the treaty, and the Modocs went north to the Klamath Reservation. And from the very beginning, there was trouble. The reservation was on a territory that had belonged to the Klamath Indians, and the Klamaths treated the Modocs as intruders on their land. And when the Modocs cut rails to fence their assigned farmlands, the Klamaths would come and steal the rails. Supplies promised by the government, guess what? Never showed up. The reservation agent issued food and clothing to the Klamaths, but there never seemed to be any for the Modocs. The great council in Washington, the Congress, didn't vote any money to buy supplies for the Modocs. So now what they were promised, Congress didn't feel any need to support that. So when Captain Jack saw his people growing hungry, see that repeated theme here? He led them off the reservation. They went down into Lost River Valley, where they had once lived in search of game and fish and camas roots. And white ranchers who lived in the valley, however, they did not want the Modocs to be there. However, they complained frequently to the government authorities. And Captain Jack cautioned his people to steer clear of the white men. These were the people that they were okay with at the beginning. Now he's having to tell them to steer clear of them. But it wasn't easy for 300 Indians to remain invisible. So during the summer of 1872, the Indian Bureau warned Captain Jack, warned him, return to the Klamath Reservation. Jack replied that his people couldn't live with the Klamaths. He requested a Modoc reservation somewhere on the Lost River, which had always been Modoc country. The Indian Bureau considered the request a reasonable one, but the ranchers opposed granting any part of their rich grazing lands to the Indians. That's funny how that flipped around like that. This is now the ranchers' lands. They didn't want to give it back to the Modocs. And we're not talking a century and a half out. We're talking a year or two out. And so the Indian Bureau considered this. They considered it reasonable, but they didn't grant it. They told the Modocs, you have to move back. This was in 1872. Government said, you have to move back to the Klamath Reservation. And Jack refused to go. So what happens next? The same repeat of the scenario we've been seeing all along here. The Army was assigned the duty of transferring the Modocs by force back to the Klamath Reservation. And so on November 28th of 1872, in a freezing rain, Major James Jackson and a company of 38 troopers of the 1st Cavalry marched out of Fort Klamath bound south for Lost River. And just before daylight, the cavalrymen arrived at the Modoc camp. They dismounted, and with carbines at the ready, they surrounded the lodges. Scarface Charlie and several other men came outside with their weapons. Major Jackson asked to see the chief, and when Jack appeared, the major told him that he had orders from the Great Father in Washington to take the Modocs back to Klamath Reservation. I will go, Captain Jack said. I will take all my people with me, but I do not place any confidence in anything you white people tell me. You see, you came here to my camp when it's dark. You scare me and all my people when you do that. I won't run from you. Come up to me like men when you want to talk with me. Major Jackson said he was not there to make trouble. And then he ordered Jack to assemble his men in front of the soldiers. And by the way, they just arrived there and said, you got to go now. Gather your stuff. And so as soon as this was done, the major pointed to a bunch of sagebrush at the end of the formation. Lay your gun here, he commanded to Jack. What for? Jack asked. You are the chief. You lay down your gun. All your men will do the same. You do that, and we'll have no trouble. Captain Jack hesitated. He knew his men would not want to give up their arms. I have never fought white people yet, Jack said, and I don't want to. The major insisted that they give up their guns. I won't let anyone hurt you, he promised, while they had, meanwhile, all these carbines aimed at everybody. Captain Jack placed his gun on the sagebush and signaled the others to do as he had done. They stepped up one by one, stacking their rifles. Scarface Charlie was the last. He laid his rifle on top of the pile, but he kept his pistol strapped around his waist. The major ordered him to hand over the pistol. I said this yesterday or the day before. Do you notice the first thing a tyrannical government wants to do to the people is disarm them? You apply that to the Second Amendment of the Constitution. By the way, all of these men, these soldiers, all these people, all these whites were living under that same Constitution we have now. Everybody knew the Second Amendment. They had a right to keep and bear arms. Yet they're asking these people, the Modocs, to turn over every last one of theirs. The major ordered Scarface Charlie to hand over his pistol. You got my gun, Scarface replied. The major called to Lieutenant Fraser Boutell. Disarm him. By force, they're going to take his pistol away from him. Give me that pistol, damn you, quick, Boutel ordered as he stepped forward. Scarface Charlie laughed. He said he was not a dog to be shouted at. Don't shout at me. I'm not a dog. Fuck off. Is basically what he's saying. Boutel drew his revolver. You son of a bitch. I'll show you how to talk back to me. That's the reaction. You son of a bitch. I'll show you how to talk back to me. Scarface repeated that he was not a dog, adding that he would keep his pistol. It's my pistol, I'm keeping it. As Boutel brought his revolver into firing position, Scarface quickly drew his pistol from his belt. Both men fired at the same time. The Modoc's bullet tore through the lieutenant's coat sleeve. Scarface was not hit. He swung toward the stack of arms, sweeping his rifle from the top, and every Modoc warrior followed example. The cavalry commander ordered his men to open fire, and for a few seconds there was a lively exchange of shots, and then the soldiers retreated, leaving 1 man dead and 7 wounded on the field. By this time, the Modoc women and children were in their log dugouts, paddling southward for the Tule Lake. Captain Jack and his warriors followed along the shore, keeping hidden in the thick reeds. They were heading for the Modoc's legendary sanctuary south of the lake, the California Lava Beds. Now, if you live in California, you know where this place is. Way up in northern California near the Oregon border. And now the Lava Beds was a land of burned out fires that had turned into rocky fissures, caves, and crevices, and some of the ravines were 100 feet deep. The cave which Captain Jack chose as his stronghold was a crater-like pit surrounded by a network of natural trenches and lava rock breastworks. He knew that his handful of warriors could fight off an army if necessary, but he hoped the soldiers would just leave them alone now. Surely the white men would not want these useless rocks. So when Major Jackson's soldiers had come back to Captain Jack's camp, a small band of Modocs led by Hooker Jim was camped on the opposite side of Lost River. In the early hours of the morning, while Captain Jack was fleeing with his people for the lava beds, he had heard gunfire from the direction of Hooker Jim's camp. I ran off and I did not want to fight, he said afterward. They shot some of my women and they shot my men. I did not stop to inquire anything about it, but left and went away. I had very few people and I did not want to fight. And this was Hooker Jim. And you can find that quote of his came from the U.S. 43rd Congress in their first session. It's a House executive document. So not for a day or two did he discover what had happened to Hooker Jim's people. And then suddenly Hooker Jim appeared outside Jack's stronghold. With him were Curly-Headed Doctor, Boston Charlie, and 11 other Modocs. They told Jack that at the time the soldiers came to his camp, several settlers had come to their camp and started shooting at them. And these white men shot a baby out of its mother's arms, killed an old woman, and wounded some of the men. And on their way to the lava beds, Hooker Jim and his men decided to avenge the deaths of their people, stopping briefly at isolated ranch houses along the way. They had killed 12 settlers. You see how these wars start. We got to go out to break. You sit tight. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, thanks for sitting there and waiting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and watch the video simulcast of the show and join the live chat room going on right now. Join the conversation with the other Intrepids. You can find that at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we're jumping right back into this. You see how war with the Indians began. It follows the same pattern that we've seen all the way along here. The Indians have their land. The whites want to settle in the open country. They start taking the land. The Indians say, oh, wait a minute, you can share it, but you can't have it. Then the whites start to push them off their land. Then they want to write a treaty that says, you give us this land and you go stay over there, or at a reservation we've set up. And the Indians are like, why do we need to go to a reservation? This is our home. So the whites say, because we're taking it. So they write a treaty. They force the Native Americans to sign. Then they don't keep up their end of the treaty. And the Indians say, you know what? Screw your treaty. I'm going back home to my homeland where you guys are settling. Then the settlers start getting worked up. Then the army comes in to move them back off by force if necessary. Then they want to take all their weapons, which they used to hunt. In the case of Captain Jack and the Modocs, they'd never had a war with the whites. Why do you want our guns? Then they start mistreating them. Then you see this exchange between Scarface Charlie and this Lieutenant Bouter, or whatever his name was. And they start fighting, start shooting. Everybody goes for their guns, and they start chasing them. Then the settlers come in. They start, at the same time that the army went up to Captain Jack's camp, they went over to Hooker Jim's camp, and the settlers and started killing them at the same time. This was all pre-planned. And so the way that the Indians had lived for a very long time, on their way as they're running out, they attacked settlements and pioneers, and they killed them along the way. They killed 12 white settlers. Now you can imagine, now this is the way they worked. This was their paradigm. Now you can imagine how the whites reacted to that. This is now all-out war. At first, Jack thought that Hooker Jim was merely boasting, but the others said it was true. Yeah, there were 12 white settlers that we killed. And when they named the dead white men, Jack couldn't believe it. Some of them were settlers he knew and that he trusted. What did you kill those people for? He said to his own people. He demanded, I never wanted you to kill my friends. You've done it on your own responsibility. Jack is just appalled at the fact that this is what his people were doing. And so he knew for certain now that the soldiers would be coming. Now that that's just fucking great. You've just killed good white people, and you know what you've done? You're bringing war down on our heads. Even worse than what the soldiers were doing back in my camp. And the soldiers would be coming even into the vastness of the lava beds. They would come for revenge. And because he was chief of the Modocs, he would have to answer for the crimes of Hooker Jim and the others. And I know that feeling, and not the same type of scenario, but have you ever been in a leadership position where the buck stops at your desk and you're like, God damn it, you guys, I have to answer for this now. Thanks very much. That's the way he felt. And not until the ice moon did the soldiers come. It was on January 13th of 1873. The Modocs, guarding the outer defense ring, sighted a bluecoat reconnaissance party approaching a bluff overlooking the lava beds. The Modocs drove them away with a few long-distance shots. And 3 days later, a force of 225 regular soldiers, supported by 104 Oregon and California volunteers, came riding like ghosts through the fog of a wintry afternoon. They took positions along ridges facing Captain Jack's stronghold. And as darkness fell, they began building sagebrush fires to keep warm. The military commander, and by the way, that smells really good. I had once had a horse ranch about 10 years ago, my wife and I. And we had, on that 40 acres that we had, there was, we estimated probably over 1,000 sage bushes. And so we used to pluck the sage and we'd build fires with it. Great smelling. You ever sage a house or do something like that? That was that smell. It was fantastic. I used to send my little girls, my twins who are now 28 years old, when they were like 7, 8, 9 years old, I'd send them out into the pastures and gather up clumps of these at the right time and dry the sage, and then we'd bundle them up and tie them up, and we'd go to some of these rendezvous and these shows and events, and we'd sell the bundles of sage. So it's a great smell, by the way. But this is what that's just anecdotal to the story here. And they lit their sagebush fires to keep warm. The military commanders, they were hopeful that if the Modocs saw the force arrayed against them, they might just come in and surrender. Now, Captain Jack, he was all in favor of surrendering. He knew that the soldiers most of all wanted the Modocs who had killed the settlers, and he was willing to put his life, along with theirs, in the live radio, along with theirs, in the hands of the soldier chiefs, rather than sacrifice the lives of all his people in a bloody battle. And so Hooker Jim, curly-headed Doctor, and those who had killed the settlers were opposed to any surrender at all, and they forced Jack to call a council to vote on what action the tribe should take. Of the 51 warriors in the stronghold, only 14 wanted to surrender. 37 voted to fight the soldiers to death. Before daylight on the 17th of January, 1873, they could hear the soldiers' bugles echoing across the fog-shrouded lava beds. Not long afterward, howitzers sounded the beginning of the bluecoat attack, and the Modocs were ready for them. Camouflaged with sagebush head coverings, they moved in and out of the crevices, picking off soldiers in the first skirmish line. And by midday, the attackers were spread out for more than a mile, their communications badly broken because of fog and terrain. And keeping under cover, the Modoc warriors hurried back and forth along the front, and they created an illusion of superiority of numbers. And when one company of soldiers moved up close to the stronghold, the Modoc fire concentrated on it, the women joining the warriors in the shooting. And late in the day, Jack and Ellen's man led a charge that routed the soldiers who left their casualties on the field. So just before sunset, the fog lifted, and the Modocs could see the soldiers retreating to their camp on the ridge. The warriors went out to where the dead bluecoats were lying. They found 9 carbines and 6 belts of cartridges. Further on were more ammunition and some army rations that had been thrown away by the fleeing soldiers. So when darkness came, the Modocs built a big fire and celebrated. None had been killed in the fighting, and none was seriously wounded. So they'd captured enough rifles and ammunition to fight for another day. Now, the next morning, they were ready for the soldiers. But when the soldiers came, there were only a few of them. They were carrying a white flag. They wanted to recover their dead. Before the end of that day, all soldiers were gone from the ridge. Believing that the Bluecoats would return, Captain Jack kept his scouts far out to watch for them. But the days passed one after another, and the soldiers stayed far away. "We fought the Indians through the lava beds to their stronghold," the commander of the attacking force reported, "which is the center of miles of rocky fissures, caves, crevices, gorges, and ravines. 1,000 men would be required to dislodge them from their almost impregnable position. And it must be done deliberately, with a free use of mortar batteries, cannons. Please send me 300 foot troops at the earliest date." And this is the official record of this request. This was a request made by, I'm clicking on my footnote here and it doesn't want to come up. Hold on a second, guys. Well, come on now. There it is. Oh, this is part of the congressional record. And on February 28th of 1873, Captain Jack's cousin, Winema, came to the lava beds. Winema was married to a white man named Frank Riddle, and he and 3 other white men accompanied her. These men had been friendly to the Modocs in the time when they visited freely in Eureka. And Winema was a cheerful, energetic, round-faced young woman who now called herself Toby Riddle. She had adopted the ways of her husband, but Jack trusted her. She told him that she had brought the white men to have a talk with him, and that they intended to spend the night in the stronghold to prove their friendship. Jack assured her that they were all welcome. No harm would come to any of them. So in the council which followed, the white men explained that the Great Father in Washington had sent out some commissioners who wanted to talk peace. The Great Father hoped to avoid a war with the Modocs, and he wanted the Modocs to come and talk with the commissioners so that they could find a way to peace. The commissioners were waiting at Fairchild's Ranch not far from the lava beds. Now, imagine what's going on in Washington. Could you imagine being part of Congress or being the president at this time, and year after year, all you're seeing is all these wars being fought out in the frontier with the Indians, and you have to keep repeating things. You know, you'd think the message would have sunk in by then, but no. They were at war. They were moving the Indians off of their land. So this continued to go on. So in the council which followed, they made this decision to go see the commissioners that were waiting at Fairchild's Ranch that wasn't far from the lava beds. So when the Modocs raised the question of what would happen to Hooker Jim's band for killing the Oregon settlers, they were told that if they surrendered as prisoners of war, they would not be held and subject to trial under Oregon law. They would be treated like they were members of an opposing army. Instead, they'd be taken away, placed on a reservation in one of the warm places, the Indian Territory or Arizona. And so go back and tell the commissioners, Jack replied, that I'm willing to hear them in council and see what they've got to offer me and my people. Tell them to come see me or send for me. I will go and see them if they will protect me and from my enemies while I'm holding these peace councils. Now, next morning, the visitors departed, Winema promising that she would inform Jack when the time and place would come for the council. And that same day, Hooker Jim and his followers slipped away to Fairfield's Ranch, sought out the commissioners, and declared that they wanted to surrender as prisoners of war. The members of the Peace Commission were Alfred B. Meacham, who had once been the Modoc's agent in Oregon, Eleazar Thomas, a California clergyman, and L.S. Dyer, a subagent from the Klamath Reservation. So overseeing their activities was the commissioner of the troops, gathered outside the lava beds, General Edward R.S. Canby. And that same Canby, who was an Eagle chief who had fought and made peace with Manuleto's Navajo 12 years earlier in New Mexico. We talked about Canby and Manuleto Manuelito, way back at the beginning of this series. So when Hooker Jim's Modocs came into Canby's headquarters with their startling announcement of surrender, the general was so delighted that he dispatched a hasty telegram to the great warrior Sherman in Washington, informing him that the Modoc War was ended and requesting instruction as to when and where he should transport his prisoners of war. In his excitement, Canby failed to put Hooker Jim and his 8 followers under arrest. The Modocs wandered out into the military camp to have a closer look at the soldiers who were now supposed to protect them from the citizens of Oregon. And during their rounds, they happened to meet an Oregon citizen who recognized them and threatened to have them arrested for murdering settlers on Lost River. The governor of Oregon had demanded their blood in revenge. And as soon as the governor got his hands on them, the law would hang them. And so at the first opportunity, Hooker Jim and his band mounted their horses and rode as fast as they could back to the lava beds. They warned Captain Jack not to go to Fairchild's ranch to meet the commissioners. The proposed council was a trap to catch the Modoc and send them back to Oregon and be hanged. So during the next few days, as Winema and Frank Riddle came and went with messages, the suspicions of Hooker Jim's Modocs proved to be true insofar as they were concerned. Political pressure from Oregon forced General Canby and the commissioners to withdraw their offer of amnesty to Hooker Jim's band. Captain Jack and the remainder of the Modocs, however, were free to come in and surrender with a guarantee of protection. Captain Jack was now caught in a classic dilemma. If he abandoned Hooker Jim's people, he could save his own. But Hooker Jim had come to him for protection under the chieftainship of the Modocs, which was as strong a law as any white man's law. And on March 6th, with the help of his sister Mary, Jack wrote a letter to the commissioners, and she delivered it to Fairchild's ranch. "Let everything be wiped out, washed out, and let there be no more blood," he wrote. "I've got a bad heart about these murderers. I've got but a few men, and I don't see how I can give them up. Will they give up their people who murdered my people while they were asleep? I never asked for the people who murdered my people. I can see how I could give up my horse to be hanged, but I can't see how I could give up my men to be hanged. I could give up my horse to be hanged and wouldn't cry about it, but if I gave up my men, I would have to cry about it." So this is the letter that he sent in. And this was from a book, this quote, from Great Indian Chiefs, published by Whittlesey House in 1938 by Albert Britt, was the author. Now remember, a lot of these books that we're seeing in these congressional records and so on came a few years later. This book was written, about 40, 30, maybe 60, 70 years after these events is when this was published. So Canby and the commissioners, however, still wanted to meet Captain Jack. They wanted to persuade him that war for his people would be worse than surrendering the killers. Even though the great warrior Sherman advised Canby to use his soldiers against the Modocs so that no other reservation for them will be necessary except graves among their chosen lava beds. That was the word from Sherman. Use the soldiers against the Modocs. Sherman. Use the soldiers against the Modocs so that no other reservation will be necessary except their graves. But the general kept his patience. On March 21st, Captain Jack and Scarface Charlie sighted Canby and a small cavalry escort riding down from the ridge overlooking their stronghold. Jack didn't know what to make of this bold approach. He deployed his warriors among the rocks and watched a lone figure ride forward from the escort. The man was an army surgeon, and he proposed an informal meeting between Captain Jack and General Canby. A few minutes later, they were conversing. Canby assured Jack that if he would lead his people out of the lava beds, they would be well treated. They'd be given food, clothing, presents. Jack replied by asking Canby why he had not brought some of the things with him if he had so much to give the Modocs. He also asked Canby why he didn't take the soldiers away. All that the Modocs wanted was to be left alone, he said. So during this short meeting, neither Jack nor Canby made any mention of Hooker Jim's band and the killing of the settlers. Jack promised nothing. He wanted to wait, and he wanted to see what Canby was going to do next. Can you blame them for not trusting the words of these guys? So what Canby did next was to bring in additional troops and dispose them on opposite sides of the Modoc stronghold. Companies of the 1st Cavalry and the 21st Infantry, supported by the 4th Artillery, were now in this easy striking distance of the Indians. And on April 2nd, Captain Jack sent a message to the commissioners. He wanted to meet them halfway between the nearest soldier camp and his stronghold. And that same day, Canby, Meacham, Thomas, and Dyer, with Winema and Frank Riddle, rode out to a rocky basin below the soldier camp on the bluff. And Jack, Hooker Jim, and several other Modocs were waiting for them there. They had brought along their women as an indication of peaceful intentions. And although Jack greeted Meacham as an old friend, he spoke somewhat bitterly to Canby, asking him why he had moved his soldiers so close and on both sides of the Modoc stronghold. You made all these wonderful words to me the other day. Now you got your soldiers all over the place. So Canby tried to pass the question off lightly by replying that he'd moved his headquarters closer to Jack's headquarters so they could meet more easily in councils, and that the soldiers were needed to make him feel safe. Now, Jack saw right through that. He didn't accept Canby's explanation, and he demanded that the soldiers be taken out of the lava beds and sent home. And then he brought up the sensitive subject of Hooker Jim's band. There could be no further talk of surrender. Jack said unless Hooker Jim's people were treated the same as all other Modocs, Canby replied that the army would have to decide what would be done with them and where they would go. He could promise no amnesty for the sellers or the killers of the settlers. And while they were talking, dark clouds overspread the lava beds, and a cold rain began to fall. Canby said that further talks would not be possible in the rain. "You're better clothed than I," Jack replied mockingly, "and I won't melt like snow." I love that response. You're dressed for the weather. You can handle this, and I'm not going to melt, so we're okay. And that's from Wigwam and Warpath. It was published in 1875, just 2 years after this, by A.B. Meacham, who was present at this meeting. So Canby ignored Jack's remark, but announced that he would have a tent shelter erected for the next meeting. Now, the next morning, Canby sent some of his soldiers down to erect a council tent. They did not place it in the rocky basin, but instead chose a sagebrush flat that was in full view of the soldier camp and its formidable batteries of artillery. And 2 days later, Jack sent a message to Alfred Meacham. He stated that he wanted to meet him and his old friend John Fairchild, who owned the nearby ranch. Jack stipulated that they were not to bring General Canby or Reverend Thomas. So Meacham and Fairchild were puzzled by the request, but they went out to the council tent with Winema and Frank Riddle. The Modocs were waiting, and Jack greeted the white men warmly. He explained that he did not trust Canby because he wore a blue uniform and talked too much about his friendship for Indians. His talk didn't ring with truth, Jack said, because he kept bringing his soldiers closer and closer and closer to the lava beds. As for the Reverend Thomas, he was a Sunday doctor. He called him, quote-unquote, a Sunday doctor, and his holy medicine was opposed to the Modocs' beliefs. "Now we can talk," Jack said. "I know you, and I know Fairchild. I know your hearts." And he went on to explain how the soldiers had forced them to flee Lost River and take shelter in the lava beds. "Give me a home on Lost River," Jack said. "I can take care of my people. I don't ask anybody to help me. We can make a living for ourselves. We don't need any of your stuff or your junk. We're fine. And we can make a living all on our own. Let us have the same chance that other men have." Yes, you can. You keep interrupting. See, I'm telling you, folks, I have children that I tell specifically, do not come in while I'm doing radio. What do? They come in while I'm doing radio. I love you too. Bye. Get out. We'll talk when I'm done. There you go, folks. Office and studio at home. Wife is out of town. And so when the children just want something, they don't care that I'm recording. Well, at least the little one, the 5-year-old. First she came in with this. I don't know if you noticed it. If you can see this on the camera, and she held it up. She wanted to eat this. And I'm like, no, you can't have that right now. It's too late to have that. Then now she just came in with a popsicle. So there you go, folks. That's my life. That's my life in my studio. So there you have it. So let's get back to this. Meacham pointed out that the Lost River was in Oregon, where the Modocs had shed the blood of white settlers. Now, the whites don't seem to be able to take any responsibility for what they were causing in this end of the war, on their end of the war, or the battles that took place. It's all the Indians. So you killed white people. Well, hey, dumbass, you guys started killing us first. So Meacham pointed out that this is where some of the Modocs had killed white settlers. And the blood would always come up between you and the white men, the commissioner declared. So Jack sat in silence for a few minutes. "I hear your words," he said. "Then give me this lava bed for a home. I can live here. Take away your soldiers. We can settle everything. Nobody will ever want these rocks. Give me a home here." Meacham replied that the Modocs could not stay in peace in the lava beds unless they gave up the men who committed the killings on Lost River. And mind you, remember, Jack did not request of the white army and the whites that they turn over the people that killed his people. They would be treated fairly, Meacham said, and he promised in a court of law. "Who will try them?" Jack asked. "White men or Indians?" "Well, white men, of course," Meacham admitted. "Then you will give up the men who killed the Indian women and children on Lost River to be tried by the Modocs, right?" Meacham shook his head. "The Modoc law is dead. The white man's law rules the country now. Only one law lives at a time." "Will you try the men who fired on my people?" Jack replied. "By your own law?" Meacham knew, and Captain Jack knew, that this could not be done. "The white man's law rules the country," the commissioner repeated. "The Indian law is dead." "The white man's laws are good for the white man," Jack said, "but they are made so as to leave the Indian out. No, my friend, I cannot give up the young men to be hung. I know they did wrong. Their blood was bad. They did not begin. The white men began first. No, I cannot give up my young men. Take away the soldiers and all the trouble will stop." "The soldiers cannot be taken away," Meacham replied, "while you stay in the lava beds." Grasping Meacham's arm, Jack asked imploringly, "Tell me, my friend, what am I to do? I don't want to fight." "The only way now to peace is to come out of the rocks," Meacham told him bluntly. "No peace can be made while you stay in the lava beds." "You asked me to come out and put myself in your power," Jack cried. "I cannot do it. I am afraid. No, I am not afraid, but my people are. I am the voice of my people. I am Modoc. I am not afraid to die. I can show Canby how a Modoc can die. Both men knew there was nothing more to be said. Meacham invited Jack to return with him to the soldier camp and continue their discussions with General Canby and the other commissioners, but Jack, of course, refused. He said that he must first counsel with his people, and that he would not let the commissioners know, and that he would let the commissioners know if there was any more to talk about. That's where we have to wrap it for tonight, folks. Monday we will pick this up again, Captain Jack and his ordeal. And in the meantime, you have a good weekend. We'll see you right here, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time on Sunday morning for It's Sunday. So have a good night tonight, the rest of your night, and a good day tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday. And we'll see you here on Sunday morning. And if you don't make it for that, right back here at 9 p.m. Monday night next week. Have a good night.